Last year, I decided to go camping alone in the forest about an hour from my house. It wasn't meant to be anything special, just a short trip to clear my head and enjoy the outdoors. Although I was inexperienced, I figured spending just one night in the woods wouldn't be a big deal. When I arrived at the first camping trail, I noticed 3 cars parked along the road next to it. The idea of running into other campers didn't appeal to me. I wanted solitude, not small talk. So I kept driving, scanning for a less traveled trail. A few miles down the road, I found another path. There were no designated parking spots, so I had to park further down the road and walk back to the trailhead. This trail was thin, overgrown, and all dirt, not gravel like the popular ones, making it clear that few people ever came this way. It was exactly what I was looking for. As I started down the trail, the terrain was relatively flat, surrounded by thick woods and tangled bushes. Felt remote, isolated, perfect. 2 hours passed as I trekked deeper into the forest. The path narrowed gradually, to the point where I couldn't even tell if I was still on it. I had a nagging feeling this might happen, but by then, I was too far in to worry. I decided to turn around and retrace my steps, trying to find the more defined portion of the trail. Barely 5 minutes later, I froze. Ahead of me, nestled among the trees, was a cabin. It stood like a ghostly relic, weathered and crooked, in the middle of nowhere. My heart sank. I hadn't seen it earlier, so how could it be here now? A chill ran down my spine. What was a cabin doing so deep in the forest, far from any roads or paths? Curiosity got the better of me. I approached cautiously, noting its dilapidated state. The door was missing, and as I peeked inside, I was greeted by the sight of old garbage scattered across the floor. Broken furniture and faded newspapers lay in disarray. The place reeked of decay. I felt the air grow heavy, an invisible pressure urging me to leave. As I turned to leave, a loud thump came from inside the cabin. My blood ran cold. I spun around, and through the open doorway, a man stepped out from behind a wall. He was middle-aged, his clothes torn and filthy, his face blank and emotionless. He looked like he had been living there or surviving there for who knows how long. I stammered sorry as I backed away, my voice barely audible. The man didn't respond. He just stared at me, unblinking. I quickly turned and walked away, my heart pounding in my chest. Glancing over my shoulder, I saw him still standing there, his eyes following me as I disappeared into the trees. The next hour was pure agony. I felt exposed, vulnerable. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me whip my head around, expecting to see him following me. I was hopelessly lost, the sun sinking fast below the horizon. As the shadows deepened, panic set in, but just as the last light of day faded, I stumbled onto the faint remains of the trail. Relief washed over me. I debated heading straight to my car, but the darkness made the idea of navigating unfamiliar terrain too risky. I decided to camp for the night and set up my tent in a small clearing. I unpacked my gear mechanically, too drained and anxious to bother with a fire or anything else. I just wanted the night to pass. Lying in my sleeping bag, I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the forest felt amplified in the silence. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke abruptly. It was pitch black, the air inside the tent heavy and stifling. At first, I wasn't sure why I had woken up. Then I heard it, the faint rustle of fabric. My eyes darted to the tent's entrance, and my breath caught in my throat. Through the half-open flap, I saw him, the man from the cabin. His face was partially illuminated by the faint moonlight, his eyes locked onto mine. He was crouched, his head and shoulders inside the tent. A surge of adrenaline hit me like a wave. I shot upright with a gasp. The man recoiled, retreating out of the tent in an instant. I scrambled to my feet and burst out, just in time to see his silhouette disappearing into the woods. His footsteps faded, swallowed by the night. My hands shook violently as I tore down the tent, stuffing everything haphazardly into my bag. I didn't care about the noise or whether I was leaving anything behind. My only thought was getting back to my car as fast as possible. With the flashlight trembling in my grip, I followed the trail, every step feeling like a race against an unseen predator. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors, started the engine, and sped away, not daring to look back. Even now, I can still see his face, those unblinking eyes watching me through the darkness. I shudder to think what he was planning to do if I hadn't woken up when I did. I never went back to that forest, and I don't talk about that night often. But sometimes, when the night is quiet, I can almost hear the faint rustle of fabric and see those eyes staring back at me. I had taken my RV out to a forest a couple of miles from my house. I live in a rural area surrounded by vast stretches of forest, so camping is a pretty common thing around here. The place I had driven out to wasn't all that well known, though. It was a small camping spot just big enough to fit a few RVs, but I liked it because rarely would anyone else be there. The path to drive down was wide enough to easily fit my RV, and I enjoyed the solitude. When I got there, the grassy field I parked in was empty, as expected. I had no specific plans, so I decided to stay in for a bit before heading out to set up the exterior of the RV. The sun was still high, so I spent some time organizing things outside, setting up the overhanging tent, and getting my chair arranged. I wanted to make sure I was prepared before it got too dark out, so I went out into the woods behind the RV, just far enough that I couldn't see the campsite anymore. The woods were quiet, with the soft rustle of trees and leaves in the breeze. The ground was still damp from a rainfall a couple of nights ago, which made finding dry wood for the campfire a bit of a challenge. I spent about 20 minutes walking deeper into the forest, searching for dry sticks and logs. It was peaceful, but I couldn't shake a subtle feeling of unease, an awareness that something wasn't quite right, though I couldn't put my finger on it. When I returned to the RV, I noticed a man had set up a tent nearby. He was nodding at me as I came back into the campsite, and I returned the gesture, acknowledging his presence. There was nothing about him that seemed strange, just another camper, probably. But I couldn't help feeling a slight annoyance. I had come out here for peace and solitude, and now it looked like I'd be sharing the area with someone else. I tossed the dry wood onto the ground and went back inside my RV to grab a beer and sit inside. The day was still warm, so I left the sunroof open, feeling the breeze wash over me. I'm not sure how much time had passed, maybe 30 minutes, before I got up and checked out the window. The man had finished setting up his tent. At first glance, it seemed like just another tent, but something wasn't right. The tent was old in a way that went beyond just being used. It had holes and gashes all over it, and flaps of fabric hung loose in the wind. It looked like something that had been left outside for years, completely neglected. It was in such poor condition that it wouldn't have offered much more shelter than simply sleeping out in the open. My curiosity piqued. I looked around the campsite for the man, but he was nowhere in sight. It was strange. Why would someone use such a worn-out tent, and where had he gone? I shrugged it off, but a part of me kept glancing toward the tent, wondering if it was some kind of strange omen. As the sun began to set, I started the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance in the growing darkness. I sat beside the fire, still unsure where the man had gone, but there was an unsettling quiet to the night. The forest around me was silent, save for the crackling of the fire. The darkness seemed to press in closer, and I kept thinking about the man and his odd tent. It didn't make sense. It had been hours since the sun set, and yet he still hadn't returned to his campsite. My mind began to race. Where had he gone? Why hadn't he come back? My thoughts wandered as the darkness crept deeper into the woods, leaving only the dim light of the campfire to ward it off. I checked my watch, 1 a.m. It had been dark for almost 4 hours now. I stood up from my chair, feeling the unease grow inside me. I walked toward the man's tent, wondering if maybe he had returned without me noticing. "Are you in there?" I called out softly. There was no response. I stood there for a moment, listening to the night, but all I could hear was the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I looked around, hoping to spot him in the distance, but the surrounding forest felt like it was closing in. That's when I saw it. A sudden movement by one of the trees made me freeze. My eyes struggled to focus in the dim light, but then I saw him. A figure standing very still, barely visible, as if trying not to be seen. I couldn't make out his features, but the shape of him was unmistakable. A cold wave of fear washed over me. I couldn't be sure, but I wasn't entirely convinced it was the same man I'd seen earlier. The longer I stared, the more my certainty faded. Something about the way he stood, so still, so unnatural, was off. I took a few slow steps back, trying not to make a sound, but my heart was pounding in my chest. Every instinct told me to run. I backed toward the RV, slowly, keeping my eyes locked on him. But I couldn't tear myself away, and when I reached the door, I hurried inside, peering out the window. He hadn't moved, not an inch, but now I could see him more clearly. He was looking straight at me, staring intently. My pulse raced, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the ignition. After a brief, agonizing hesitation, I turned the key and fired up the engine. My heart was pounding as I slowly pulled away from the campsite, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something I couldn't see. As I drove away, my mind raced with possibilities. What if that wasn't the man from the tent at all? What if it was someone else just standing out there, watching? And what if the man from the tent was somewhere else in the woods, hidden, watching me without my knowledge? The thought made my skin crawl. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, and the fear that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't alone out there. I live out by the Rocky Mountains in the Northwest. I don't go camping all that often anymore now that I'm older, but I'd say I go out there maybe once a year. I'm more of a sitting in the backyard kind of person, but going out into the mountains was always worth the hassle when I did go out. This was a couple of years ago when I'd gone out in the early weeks of fall. The trail I chose was only a 20-minute drive from me. I parked off to the side in a small dirt parking lot, then grabbed my bags and started walking. It was a little colder than I was anticipating, but the trail was a really nice walk. When I got to the campsite, I set everything down and got my tent up. It was a very small, open area with nothing but trees surrounding it. There were no other tents or anything, so it looked like I was the only one camping out there. The sun was still pretty high up, so after a quick break, I set out on a thin side path that went to an overlook of the mountains I had seen online before I'd left. It was only a 10-minute walk from the campsite, so I didn't bring much other than a water bottle and my basic backpack. When I got there, I sat down and enjoyed the view for about half an hour. Again, it didn't look like anyone had been out here, which, seeing as it was starting to get colder out, I guess it made sense. Once I was ready, I got up and walked back to the campsite. When I walked up to the open area, something felt wrong. Nothing that I'd left behind looked like it did when I left. Everything was just slightly off. I checked around for anything missing or obvious things having been moved around, but everything was there. Part of me wondered if I was just being paranoid. Everything that I felt was off were things that I could have just remembered wrong. Like, I was pretty sure that I'd zipped up the tent before leaving, but it was unzipped when I got back. That's not something an animal could do, and there were no other signs of people having come by. So the obvious answer would be that I just didn't zip up the tent before leaving, even though I thought I'd remember doing it. I tried to relax, putting my chair up and moving some stones around to make a fire pit as the sun was going down and the cold was setting in. I warmed up some water to make some tea with and just kind of sat there in my own thoughts. After some time, probably an hour, I heard someone walking. I turned toward the sound, seeing it was coming from where the trail was, but it was too dark now to see anything beyond the open area. While I watched and listened, it sounded like they were coming in toward the campsite, but then there were a few seconds where I didn't hear anything. I almost felt like they were looking at me from somewhere out on the trail, but then the footsteps started again, walking away from the campsite but not back on the trail. It sounded like they were walking off the trail, kind of off to the side of the campsite. I don't know, I was getting a little creeped out now. The thoughts of everything seeming off before had started to come back to mind now that I knew someone else was out here. I didn't know if they were out here before or if they had just arrived, but that's just why it was so unnerving. I didn't know what was going on. Then the footsteps started to get louder again, coming toward the campsite from the other side. I shifted my gaze, but not even a second later, I heard another set of footsteps from behind me. Both were quiet and subtle, but given everything now, it was very clear that they were trying not to be seen as they moved in closer. I quickly unzipped my bag and pulled out my handgun that I had only for desperate needs. I stood up and held it toward the trees where I could hear one of them approaching from. I didn't say anything, afraid to show the fear in my voice, but I knew they could see me in the light from the campfire, and I was just hoping that the gun would be enough to make them second-guess whatever they were trying. It went quiet. Both footsteps stopped. I turned all around looking for any movement. After a minute of no sounds at all, I started to put things back in my bag, being careful not to put down my weapon for more than a few seconds at a time. I still hadn't heard them leave, so I knew they had to be watching me from somewhere out there. Once I got what I could fit in my bag, I started to make my way to the trail, leaving only the tent behind. From what I could hear, they didn't follow me out. Once I got a decent distance away, I turned on my flashlight and made it the rest of the way to my car. To sum it up, the police were useless in this kind of scenario. Whoever the two people were that were out there had never shown themselves or really did anything at all. Don't get me wrong, it was very obvious they were planning something horrible, but there wasn't enough to go off of. But after my encounter and seeing a lot of these situations happen to others as well, I don't think I'll ever be going out there on my own again.